Thank you for joining us today for a special Ask the Expert episode of the Prostate Podcast during World Continence Week, focused on continence and life after prostate cancer treatment. My name is Katie Clift, pleased to be moderating and hosting this session because we know that for many men, changes to bladder control can be one of the most challenging aspects of recovery, not just physically, but emotionally and socially. And it's something that can affect confidence, independence, and everyday routines, but it's not always openly discussed. So today we're going to change that. We're going to have a very practical and honest conversation about continence, what to expect, what support is available, and how men can regain confidence as they move forward after treatment. And we're very pleased to be joined by Karen Newby, Clinical Development Manager at Essity, supporting the TENA brand, who brings extensive experience in continence care and patient support. Thank you so much for being with us today, Karen. It's a great privilege for us to hear from you and to host you on the podcast today. Let's start really simply right at the beginning. How common are continence issues after prostate cancer treatment? What should men expect?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Katie. I think continence changes are actually they're very common after prostate cancer treatment, particularly after surgery. Very common after radical prostatectomy, but also I think we need to think about the issues after radiation therapy as well that can cause bladder function. And the thing to note the most is that symptoms can vary between men. So it's really important that men don't compare themselves to other men that may have had similar treatments. So I think that's kind of the highlight when we're looking at continence issues, and that recovery is highly individual. After surgery, there could be a catheter involved, and when that comes out initially, so there will be some leakage there. But the improvements are gradual over time as well, which is important. And some of the symptoms when we're looking at continence issues after cancer treatment are things like stress incontinence. And what that means is where any kind of extra abdominal pressure, so any kind of lifting, coughing, sneezing, things like that can actually cause the incontinence, but also other issues such as urgency and frequency, say after radiation, where the bladder is just a little bit irritated and there may be some more trips to the toilet. And another one of the symptoms could be nocturia, for example, which is getting up a little bit more in the night. So I think, the main message with this is that recovery is often measured in small wins, like a drier morning, fewer pads, or a longer walk, or even just feeling confident to leave the house again.
And we're going to deep dive into this topic,
Yeah.
I guess, but I want to start by really zooming out and saying you guys have done an incredible amount of work in terms of advocacy and understanding and really raising awareness of this issue for men and their families over the past few years. What's your experience been, I guess, because we mentioned it at the start of the podcast that it's often a topic not talked about. Many men probably don't know where to go to support or how to even really start the conversation. And it can be difficult to accept, I think, in some cases too, that the treatment has led to this sort of side effect. So what have you seen in terms of opening the conversation and men being more confident to talk about the issue?
Yeah, I think there's so much stigma still, even now in this day and age, around continence. And I think for men in particular, being continent is very much tied very closely with independence and confidence and their masculinity and identity. So when treatment is underway or post-surgery, then men can feel embarrassment and shame and loss of control, all that kind of thing, which is kind of the opposite to being masculine and the identity that comes with that. And I think open conversations, we're doing some amazing work in the media as far as normalizing that conversation and using the right language as well around medical issues And also the earlier education and peer support, which I think is actually really helping when men first kind of enter the healthcare scene with prostate issues, then that early intervention and that multidisciplinary approach is so much better now than it used to be. And just over time, I think the more that we talk about continence, like any other treatment or side effect, the less shame there is for men in particular in this case is to carry.
Absolutely. And as I said, you're doing and you have done incredible work in this area. Let's go back to the issue at hand. And you mentioned a whole range of different treatments that can cause continence. Why do these changes happen? How long do they typically last?
Yeah, so bladder control relies on very coordinated system of muscles, nerves, and pelvic floor support. And I often say it's amazing how anybody is continent because of the complexity of the urology system and the bladder and everything that goes with it. And so prostate cancer treatments can affect continence in many ways. So, for example, surgery affects the sphincter support. So they're those little circular band of muscles in continence nurse talk that kind of help with managing continence. And because those muscles and the area has been treated or that kind of thing, then stress incontinence is very common with that type of surgery and things like coughing and even kind of getting up to go and get a drink of water that can actually cause some pressure in the leakage. And I think I said before, like the radiation as well. So these kinds of bladder irritation can happen after radiation therapy or during radiation therapy. So urgency is more common. And from a timeline perspective, like I wish I could say, oh, it's just going to be 5 days with this and a couple of weeks with that. But again, everyone's surgery is unique to you.
Mm.
And also, therefore, the recovery is going to be unique as well. The important thing to remember is that the continence journey is different for everyone, and the recovery is going to be different too. So be patient and trust your team and keep the conversation going with your team as well as you navigate your own recovery.
Absolutely. Very practically, too, then, for men who do experience bladder leakage, what are the first steps that they can take to manage it?
Okay, so the most important first step is not to suffer in silence. And I think speaking to the healthcare team early, as I said before, I call it the pre-game, is really important to get to know your team. It's not a game of tennis or squash. It's not with just two people, it is with a whole team. And so with that and with the right team and help and the specialties that come with that. Pelvic floor assessment is really important, and learning to do the exercises if you've got the time prior to surgery or prior to treatment is really important. The other important first step is getting that support and getting to know your continence nurse, which is they're going to be the glue in your journey, and they're really great at understanding the whole picture and then being able to refer out to the specialties as you go, as well as your pelvic health physiotherapists. But also, I think the important from a first step perspective is you can be asked to, start recording a bladder diary. So getting to know what your actual bladder does from a baseline perspective, when you go to the toilet, how often you go, all that kind of baseline. And so these are kind of the first steps that a man can take. And I think also preparing for you the use of products as well, so that when it comes to your surgery or your treatment, then you're not just kind of trying things for the first time. And so these first steps prior to treatment are really important so that what's coming up, and then you can actually then deal with any of the issues that come with it along the way.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that emphasis on preparation. That's really important. If we zoom out to, can you tell us what good continence care looks like today, maybe how it's evolved in recent years?
Yeah, so I think Good Continence today is more personalized and it's very much a whole person focused. There is a pathway from the clinical kind of perspective is if this, then that. And it's very much in place as well. But I think what's changed is really looking at the holistic health of a person. So really getting, and you'll find that maybe you've got different healthcare professionals that ask the same question, but they may be looking at you from a different perspective as well. And that can be anything from pelvic floor right through to emotional support. So it really is ensuring that everything that is you is being attended to in the sessions or across your treatment. But I think from a modern perspective, it's more about it's better awareness, a lot better products than there used to be. And I think the key is, and we touched on it before, the earlier intervention and that multidisciplinary care. And I think that together with the that multidisciplinary team and also bringing in your support people as well, really including them in your team is really important too, because what goes on outside of those healthcare appointments and the support that you need or a man needs in that time is really important to their recovery, and that includes their emotional and mental support as well.
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about it already. We covered the issue of stigma, that there can be a stigma around continence. Why do you think it's still difficult then for men to talk about it? And most importantly, how do we change that? What can we do to change it?
Yeah, and I think when we goes back to the psychology of continence, and I learned this years ago when I was asked to give a webinar on the psychology of incontinence, and what came up was we when we're growing up and we go through childhood, there comes a certain age where we're little babies and our bladders are developing. And then we get to an age of about 4 or 5. And then any kind of incontinence from there is, oh, there must be something wrong. And so there's this stigma around that. And that is carried on all through our adult life. And so when we come to treatment for bladder conditions, any bladder conditions that cause incontinence, that all comes up. And so the open conversations and normalizing the support is really important. And also making sure that we are talking to men as adults and not children, and using the right language. These are treatments for bladder, just like if you hurt your arm or and you needed some stitches, it's the same kind of thing where we need to normalize that.
And this session is also about confidence, right? And building confidence in this area. Let's talk about practical tools or approaches that can help men feel more confident managing continence in their day-to-day lives. What can they do? What are the practical tools they can access?
Yes, and I think our men really excel at this, getting right to a really practical plan. Obviously, the main practical things you can do is get to your appointments, because from a perspective of your pelvic floor exercises, if you're going to a gym class, it's important to have those in your calendar and actually getting to those appointments, but also really practical things like toilet planning. So in those early part of the healing journey, you want to be out and about and you're feeling more confident, you're feeling much better, then there are things that you can do from a perspective of, if you are going out to the shops, then where are the toilets? If you're going out with family and friends, knowing where the toilets are. And there's some really great tools and apps. There's the National Toilet Map, which is fantastic. You just download the app, and then on the map, it'll show where you are and then where the nearest toilet is. The other, I think, practical part of this is your product confidence and making sure that what feels right for you from a confidence perspective, from a dignity perspective. So it's really being able to sample products. So that's very, very kind of practical, and making sure that you've got spare supplies as well. And also things like fluid management, making sure that you're looking after yourself from that perspective and staying active, all those kind of things. But I think from a perspective of an important insight is avoiding social withdrawal, being aware if you are kind of withdrawing from your family, friends, etc. And I think the goal of managing leakage from that perspective very practically is really helping men continue participating in life. I think that's a real key part too. So if you're feeling that you need some more tools, then of course you open up and ask to have those needs met.
Excellent. I really appreciate that emphasis on the social side too. That's really important. Let's hone in on the products then. How can men choose the right products of support for their needs, particularly in the early stages of recovery?
Mm. So the best product isn't necessarily the most absorbent product. It's the product that matches the needs of the man, his body, his lifestyle, and also his confidence level as well. So when we're looking at, how much volume or how much absorbency that you need, there is an assessment that can go with that. Which is measuring how much output that you have and how often that you are going to the toilet. And it might just be a small enough product to, as you're getting up out of the chair, you might get just a little bit of leakage on the way to the toilet. And some men, for example, have a larger leakage as they're kind of getting up and going to the toilet. So it's very much a individual. The body shape of each man is can be different as well. So some products you may not be as comfortable as others. And also from a mobility and activity perspective, when we're looking at the right products, it's also making sure that you've got the right skin care products as well. So we want to make sure that the urine is off the skin. So keeping the skin nice and clean and healthy, and using products that are easy to use. And I think a man early after surgery may need very different support to several months down the track as recovery progresses.
Absolutely. Let's take another step back and talk about the role of health professionals as well. I mean, you've touched on it. We talked about multidisciplinary teams and the importance of that. But what role do healthcare professionals play in supporting continence recovery? And when should men seek additional help?
Many men ask me, when should I seek help? And if the leakage seems to be getting worse, or there's any burning pain, there's blood, there's severe urgency, they're kind of the real big ones. But also there's some other symptoms as well. So if you notice that your skin's breaking down, especially if you've been having radiation therapy, so remember to include your GP and your prostate cancer nurse and letting them know that these things are happening, so that you don't have to manage those yourself, because there's very clear pathways with that. The prostate cancer nurse is definitely the one that has a very good product knowledge. So we'll be able to recommend different products, get you samples so you can try products before you buy them, as well as you've also got the pelvic health physiotherapist who'll be your best friend in the healing time, and that they are very specific and they know in detail all the musculature of the pelvic floor and all the surrounding kind of muscles as well, ensuring that you're they're building those up too, as well as the psychologist. So the psychologist is the person that you can talk to for all things as you're going through the emotional changes and mental changes through prostate cancer treatment. And that includes sexual health as well, which is a really important part of healing and understanding what's happening from that perspective. But also seeking help if you are a little bit social withdrawn, if you're noticing that, or maybe one of your loved ones has noticed that as well. So low mood, poor quality of life, all those kind of things.
And let's stay on that topic in terms of loved ones and their role in support, because that's a really big topic, I guess. And there'll be people listening who are partners, who are family members. How
Yep.
can they best support someone going through this experience?
From the perspective of the partners and families and mates, it's really helpful to listen because sometimes it takes a while to open up, and it might start off as quite on a surface, very physical conversation, but it could end up being more emotional, which is what the man might actually need. And I think also, offering some practical support, making sure that the appointments are on the calendar so everyone knows, but also you're not taking over as well. And the way I like to think about it and the way I explain it is you're walking together through support rather than a loved one taking control of the support. You're doing it together, you're standing side by side. And in that way, you are actually preserving independence. And I think that's really important. I had a conversation not long ago with a gentleman and from Gen X, and we use a lot of sarcastic kind of language and we joke around a lot. And the man that I was talking to who was going through prostate cancer treatment, and he said there was him and his wife had been together for many years, and it was this was very different. It was a very different healing journey that compared to anything else. And he really appreciated his wife kind of changing up, going a bit easy on those kind of sarcastic jokes at those really vulnerable times. And so I think when we're looking at partners and families and relationships and just being totally present there for anyone going through prostate cancer treatment because it's a real big one. It is a real big life-changing event.
Absolutely, absolutely. We talked about the role of health professionals, mates, families, partners. Let's look ahead. What improvements are we seeing in continence care? Where should men feel optimistic? What are we seeing in terms of that future outlook?
Yeah, so there's a lot better surgical precision. We're doing, a lot more with robotics. And what that means is much better or faster healing time, less blood loss, you're able to go home earlier, that kind of thing with that precision. It's just amazing how far we've come in the last decade. And I think the other thing that's really changing and to be optimistic about is the improved rehabilitation and the focus on improving healing through exercise. It's more encompassing, it's more holistic. There's with the better awareness, I think that's really changing the way that everyone sees prostate cancer treatment. And we
Mm.
also have a lot better products as well. In Europe, we've TENA actually has a little mini ultrasound, bladder ultrasound, just sits on top of the bladder. And you can see, like through your app, how much your bladder's actually holding, and it gives you a little nudge of when to go to the toilet, especially in that kind of early healing stages. So there's a lot of tech actually coming in the future as well. And all of it really is about reducing those leakages that happen where you don't want them to happen, and reducing that kind of stigma around that. And I think the future of continence care is again really focusing on helping men return to life, not just managing the symptoms.
Yeah, and I think yeah, exactly. That's one of the most important things we've talked about and we've touched on. And it's great that there's so many things that men can be optimistic about in terms of how far we've already come, but what the future holds as well. If there are men listening who are struggling with continence, where would you recommend they go for support, for trusted information about the issue, kind of to close off our conversation?
Yeah, so obviously, the PCFA has the tele nursing counselling service, which is absolutely fantastic. So, PCFA website is where I send all my gentlemen to, because it's specifically for the prostate cancer. It's easy to find things as well. You've got your team, so as well, you have all your healthcare professionals that you're seeing. And I think it's important to have them written down, because you just never know when you really need to speak to someone. There's also the National Continence Helpline as well. So they are a service that you can talk to anonymously. Again, they're all trained in helping people manage those issues through good conversations. And there's support groups as well. So I have been to the local PCFA support groups, and I remember the first one I went to, I was just overwhelmed by the mateship that has occurred, like just by the men coming together on a regular basis. And just the support, not only through emotional support and talking about your story and things like that if you choose to, but it's things like when you need help, then there's guys there and to actually help. So for example, there was a gentleman in one of the groups, and his wife had passed away, and he was having his prostate cancer treatment, and he was feeling really alone, and the guys just said, "You need any food, mate?" There was just this support that that guy really needed. It was his first time that had been to the group, and I was just so overwhelmed by that support. And I think those early conversations matter, and you don't have to have the perfect words. You're just starting a conversation, whether it is in a support group or whether it's on a telephone, just starting off with, something like, I'm struggling with leakage, and then the conversation will go from there.
Excellent. I think that's really helpful, very practical advice. We've had a very wide-ranging conversation from the future and what we're going to see, the support, practical tips for men, especially if it's a difficult conversation for them to start to have. I mean, that practical advice you just gave was fantastic. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like men, families, partners to know who are listening to the podcast today?
The support is really important, and recovery is, I know there's the physical aspect, but it's the emotional aspect as well, which is just as important. And I think that is where that confidence and dignity and independence and relationships and things like that will actually help that healing process, and making sure then that you're able to do all the physical things, the practical kind of things, diet, hydration, getting good sleep. These are really important things for recovery. It's not a squash game, it's a soccer game or a footy game.
Love that analogy. Karen, it's been a wonderful conversation with you today. Thank you so much for joining us on the Prostate Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to be here again.
Again, a very special thanks to Karen Newby for sharing her expertise and helping us, as we said at the outset, have a very open and practical conversation about continence, recovery, and of course, rebuilding confidence after prostate cancer treatment. And it's been important to highlight this issue during World Continence Week. For more information, as Karen said, if you need prostate cancer support services or to speak to a telenurse, you can call our telenursing service on 1-800 22 0099. And as always, visit prostate.org.au. It's been great to host you for this episode, and we'll see you next time on the Prostate Podcast.